Alright, so I have a sketchbook here because I am going to quickly draw some random Star Wars characters without any reference whatsoever. I'm not even gonna look around my room or anything like that, I swear. Especially because the characters that I'm gonna pick, I'm gonna try to pick someone who I cannot look at in my room. Ready? Go. Is gonna be Zem Wessel. Now, because I don't feel like drawing her human form, because she's a shapeshifter, I'm gonna go with her like final form, or I guess her true self, right? Ignore her really stupid hat. That's how I remember it. Much like most of Attack of the Clones, I remember it to be real ugly, except Ewan McGregor. I'm giving her ears. I don't know if she had them. This is the dart that's sticking out of her neck, because that's a thing. That's what kills her in the end. This is my Zem Wessel. This straight up looks like Freddy Krueger. So when I was originally going to make this video, I had the idea to do like the whole saga at once. And then I realized there was 11 movies. And then I was like, okay, I will do the first 6 movies at once. And then I realized there's so much stuff I want to talk about in terms of like the prequels, and it just wouldn't be fair to limit it down to one video without there being like a proper scope. So I'm doing it trilogy by trilogy now, folks, which seems a little unfair for this one because I did pretty much cover A New Hope's concept art in a video not too long ago, actually with a comic book that I reviewed that was called The Star Wars. Again, original title, not so much, but in that comic book there's just tons and tons of concept art that was unused or used in the final product of the Star Wars that we know and love that came out in 1977. Because I don't want to say the final product because I'm not sure there will ever really be a final product of these movies. But the really cool thing about concept art that I established in that video and that I really hope I can establish in this one is that there's just so much impressive stuff that these creators come up with that we don't even get to see in the final product, and their intentions might be totally different on the drawing board. So we're going to keep A New Hope pretty brief, I think fairly so, because again, this is a little bit redundant because I went over a lot of this before. But some of the major things about A New Hope's origins, and that this is the foundation for Star Wars and how much of it changed from the original Ralph McQuarrie illustrations. And some of them are the fact that, for instance, Darth Vader is not Luke's father. That's not something that was originally a thing. And Darth Vader actually doesn't have like the full face kind of deal. He has a face, and it is shown in the comic book, of course. Luke was actually not always the kid. Luke was actually originally going to be the master, and he's really fine looking in the comic book and the original concept art. The actual apprentice is going to be Anakin, spelled Anakin. Chewie looks like this. Chewie is Zeb from Rebels, essentially, and get used to them reusing a lot of concepts because they do take a lot of Ralph McQuarrie stuff and they do tend to condense it and put it in other places of Star Wars, because some of it is way too good not to use. Like, this is a really cool creature design. It just isn't Chewie. It becomes Zeb, which is pretty awesome. Lightsabers were originally just one color. It was originally all red. They weren't really supposed to reflect one's soul as they do now, and it's amazing how far we've come in that regard. Valorum is the Chancellor in The Phantom Menace, and he's actually just this, really hot Sith Lord that isn't quite on the same level as Vader. Vader wasn't a Sith Lord. Vader was just a strict Imperial. And it was such a motley crew. You can tell 3PO looks more like Joan Rivers from Spaceball. Darth Vader looks more like Darth Helmet from Spaceballs. The droids in general just look very weird and very sci-fi. I think that's one of the things that Ralph McQuarrie and his original artwork of A New Hope, and of course the original trilogy in general, is how like stereotypically sci-fi it looks, which there's nothing wrong with that, because nothing really came before that that would make you want to draw or think otherwise. And there is so much stuff they were able to build from. So like all of the iconic images that we eventually get come from this. Lightsabers really aren't that far off from what we receive. In terms of Tatooine was always going to be a thing. It was always going to be about the Force. The Force was always this central topic that was binding everything together. So Alderaan's design was originally supposed to look like Cloud City's design, and it was supposed to be this place that they went to as opposed to a place that, you know, blew up. And they did blow it up, I think, partially because of budgetary reasons. They just didn't have it to create Cloud City or to create what would become Cloud City. But do not fear, we get that in Empire Strikes Back. And speaking of Empire Strikes Back, Empire kind of knew what it was doing a little bit more. By the time that it was being structured out and outlined, it was definitely something that they kind of knew the direction a little more. I'm not saying everything was figured out. I talked about that before with the whole Luke and Leia romance. But in terms of artistic stylings and everything like that, I think it was a lot more succinct than A New Hope was. And that was because we've already had the foundation for a good amount of our characters. Now, you know, there was new additions, like, you know, Yoda looked a little bit different from what we saw, and he was always supposed to be kind of green and, you know, like a little hermit that was hiding out. Originally, his hut was supposed to look a lot more like a mosque, and it was supposed to be a little bit more ornate, but they eventually came up with the idea that the Jedi were a more simple creatures. They were definitely about a lack of attachment, if you will. They're definitely, you know, living a little bit more like monks as opposed to royals, and it was kind of going away from that ornate setting to being more of a hut and, you know, eating root leaf stew in the middle of a swamp. It's just a different vibe altogether. And speaking of the swamp, there was a lot more creatures that were originally supposed to make appearances than the ones that we saw in Empire Strikes Back. And we really didn't see any. We more or less, you know, get it through R2-D2's traumatic experience. And even creatures that do make appearances in The Empire Strikes Back have changed thematically as well. The Tauntauns are extremely prevalent example of this. Originally, the Tauntauns were supposed to look like rats, and then they eventually became velociraptors before they became more of what we see them today, which looks like something that you would kind of expect to be in the cold more as opposed to, you know, a rat or a velociraptor. I don't think they would have done as well considering they are not very fuzzy like Tauntauns seem to be. And Tauntauns actually originally used to eat grass on Hoth. You ask how? That's because the caves originally were lined with grass. Interesting choice, but it didn't make it into the movies or the comic books as far as we know. What Tauntauns are actually eating is a big question mark, because the only things we know that exist really are, in fact, Wampas, which are their predators, and they always were, even in concept art. Visually, though, I'd say that the planets kind of remain pretty much the same in Empire Strikes Back. You know, Hoth was always snow, and Cloud City became Cloud City based off of the Alderaan concept art from A New Hope, but it really didn't change all that much. And then Dagobah was always supposed to be a swamp. It was just a mosque in the middle of a swamp, and they decided, you know, that might not fit. But the rest of it, it's just very much similar to what we see transpired in the movie. So something about what Ralph McQuarrie was churning out, George Lucas was really eating up for Empire Strikes Back. However, there are instances when they're able to develop upon an already beautiful concept as a foundation, like I said with Yoda's hut, but also in the scene where Han Solo is about to kind of embark on his carbonite sleep. That is very reminiscent, like structurally, and how it's kind of mapped out look-wise. That's how it looks. However, it was definitely expanded upon in terms of setting the scene. The orange and the dark hues and all the smoke and the navy dark blues that were all shining in the background, and how it reflected off of the characters' faces to look like fire. I think it definitely like shows an intensity that otherwise would not be there if it just was the very palace-like structure that was originally designed. It's stuff like this when you can take the base and you can take the foundation, you can see where they got that from, and you can make it better, is what is one of the best things about Empire Strikes Back, and I think they definitely do that. Another example of that is that a Super Trooper was designed by Ralph McQuarrie, and I think you know where I'm going with this. This would eventually become the design for Boba Fett, as well as the Mandalorian armor in general, even though Boba Fett is not a Mandalorian, as per Disney canon. Don't sue me, it's the way it is. But like the Vader fight between him and Luke, that's very much the same from what we've seen in concept. A lot of like the choreography that we see is stuff that like the end point, how Luke is like hanging from that antenna type thing, that was in the concept art. And just the way that they fight, how he kind of meanders across that tightrope after getting his arm sliced off, again, in concept art. The only difference was that originally the first Luke and Vader fight was supposed to actually happen in the first movie, but he was Deke Starkiller back then, not Luke Skywalker, so I'm not counting it as much. Formerly known as Revenge of the Jedi, I think you can probably guess that they maybe changed their minds a couple times when it comes to Return of the Jedi. You would be right. It's interesting that Sy Snootles does get her debut, but not until the specialized editions, but she was in concept art. They had a lot of ideas that they didn't really get to use in Return of the Jedi, which is arguably the most edited Star Wars movie in terms of specialization and all that stuff. And while fans can be upset about that, there are some things to be said about George Lucas's original ideas getting the chance to see the light of day, not seeing they're for the best, but it's just, you know, it's kind of nice that he gets to express some of that stuff. But it was obvious with Jabba's palace, they were going for a more rustic but polished design of his it looked more like a marketplace. There was a bunch of like blue pig people that looked like little Ganondorfs walking around, as well as on the outside there's a little bit more slavery with their togas and everything, and they're all orange and emaciated. Luke's just sort of meandering in without any trouble at all. But if we're on the topic of palaces, I think that the Imperial Palace takes the cake. It does surprise me that we've never seen an Imperial Palace technically in canon, because Palpatine would definitely have one, but it would be on Coruscant, because Coruscant is the capital city. And it's not, evidently, because it doesn't look like Coruscant, because there is concept art for Coruscant for Return of the Jedi, and it's one of those lovely things that did eventually get to make the secondary cut when they were able to add all that stuff in. Once they shot what like Coruscant and Naboo and Tatooine would look like, you know, in prequel era, they were able to like really pan in over that in the end of Celebration. But this is clearly not, from what we can see, what they were thinking Coruscant would be. It almost looks like the Egyptian pyramids, like, and then a like steampunk castle right behind it, and the opening and all that stuff. Like the entranceway is super ornate, and the entranceway actually reminds me of a scene in Rebels where Ezra kind of has to go meet Palpatine, and it's weird, but it's really extra, and I'm not surprised at Palpatine, but it doesn't really strike me as it's not Imperial. It's very, you know, Sith Lord or Jedi-esque in terms of how ornate it is. The Imperials are super clinical, so I find it really shocking that they would have all this bright and pretty and sharp and stuff. But even more so that's weird is that Palpatine's throne room is in a lava room. Is it in a volcano? Is this a volcano? Like, I'm confused. And is he on the bottom? Why is he in the basement? He's the leader. Strange. I think he would be a little bit more practical. He did wait a long time to get where he is, you know? You're not that good of a strategist and you have like a lava floor. I just think that it's very extra of him. He definitely has a castle out there because Vader has one, but I don't think it looks like this. In terms of like reused things in Return of the Jedi, there is a interesting concept of like this giant green grassy hill, which I think is cool. Weird, but cool. It's not Endor, but they were definitely going for a more like vegetation-centered planet, so it was early Endor, I guess. But the shape of that is actually what they go with for like their Jedi temples that are showcased, particularly in Star Wars Rebels, which I've referenced like 50 times, because Star Wars Rebels uses so much original trilogy concept art. It's really cool. And last but not least, in terms of reusing concept art, we have the Korax, which was supposed to attack the Ewok village in Return of the Jedi, but didn't. But don't worry, because they use that again later on in a lovely little movie called Caravan of Courage. But if you thought that Return of the Jedi couldn't have gotten any crazier, they were like, how can we beat the Death Star? How can we do that? And then they said, oh wait, 2 Death Stars. I'm really glad they didn't do that. So guys, what was your favorite type of concept art from the original trilogy? Do you wish any of it actually made the final film? I don't. But that's just me personally, honestly. I think my art definitely deserves to make the film. I think my Zem Wessel really takes the cake. I'll be doing more of these videos eventually. I don't know when. I'm not going to promise when, but I will do more of these eventually. I'm going to do the prequel trilogy next, and then the sequel trilogy, and then probably one of the TV shows eventually. Let me know if you like this. May the Force be with you guys. Have a great day.